After more than 4 decades serving as a priest, listening to confessions, and walking with families through both their greatest joys and deepest tragedies, there is something I need to tell you with complete honesty. And it is not something I say lightly. It is something that has stayed with me for years and has deeply shaped my understanding of the human soul. What has hurt me the most is not the sinners who come to the confessional in tears, fully aware of their guilt, broken by their mistakes, and asking for mercy with sincerity. Nor has it been those who kneel in fear, fully conscious of their sins, begging God for forgiveness with trembling hearts. What has truly shaken me is something very different. It is seeing good people, faithful people, people who genuinely love God, approach the altar and commit something serious without even realizing it. Yes, you heard that correctly. People who attend Mass every Sunday, who pray at home, who serve in their parishes, and who are seen by others as examples of faith. And yet, week after week, they receive Holy Communion while their souls are not in a safe spiritual state. And the most painful part is not the sin itself, it is the fact that many of them have absolutely no awareness of what is happening within them. Let me ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly within your own heart. The last time you received communion, were you truly in a state of grace? I am not asking whether you felt fine. I am not asking whether you believed everything was okay. I am asking something much deeper than that. Had you examined your conscience honestly? Had you confessed any serious sins? Had you actually prepared your soul to receive the King of the universe? Pause here for a moment. Do not treat this as something routine or automatic. Think carefully, because what you are about to hear can completely change the way you understand your spiritual life. It may disturb you, but it may also save you from something far more dangerous than discomfort. A few weeks ago, a 2-year-old woman came to my office at the parish. She had been a catechist for decades, deeply involved in church life, and respected by everyone around her. For most of her life, she had been considered a truly devout woman. For over 40 years, she had attended Sunday Mass faithfully and received Holy Communion almost every week without interruption. But that day, something was different. Her face was pale, her hands were shaking, and she could barely lift her eyes. When she finally spoke, her words came through tears. "Father, I think I have been receiving communion in a state of mortal sin for years and no one ever told me." Imagine that moment. 40 years of approaching the altar, 40 years of receiving the body of Christ without a full understanding of the condition of her soul. When she finished telling her story, she began to cry in a way I rarely see. It was not a simple emotional reaction. It was the cry of someone who suddenly wakes up after decades of not seeing the truth clearly. After a long silence, she asked me a question I will never forget. "Father, if I had died last week, where would my soul be now?" In that moment, there were no easy answers, no comforting phrases, only silence, prayer, and a truth too serious to soften. And what happened to her is not an isolated case. It is something that can be happening in many lives, even today, possibly even in yours, without you realizing it. We are living in a time where the sense of sin has been weakened. People speak often about the love of God, and rightly so, because God is love. But at the same time, almost no one speaks clearly about the danger of receiving the Eucharist in an unworthy state. A false sense of security has developed. Many believe that simply attending Mass and approaching the altar is enough for everything to be fine spiritually, but the reality of the spiritual life is much deeper than that. St. Paul expressed it in words that should not be ignored. He said that anyone who receives the body of the Lord unworthily brings judgment upon themselves. These are not human opinions. They are not traditions created by the Church. They are words rooted in Scripture itself. And yet, millions of people approach communion every Sunday without ever asking themselves the most important question: what is the true state of my soul? Today, I want to speak about something that is rarely explained with clarity. There are sins that many believers commit without even recognizing them as serious. Actions and habits that society has normalized to such an extent that they no longer feel dangerous, even though spiritually they remain deeply serious. And this is where a silent reality begins. one I have witnessed repeatedly throughout my priesthood. People who love God, but were never taught how to examine their conscience deeply. People who live their faith with good intentions, but without moral clarity. People who receive communion without realizing what is happening within their own souls. That is why I am not speaking to condemn you or to frighten you without reason. I am speaking because the soul is too valuable to remain in ignorance. There are 9 specific sins, 9 spiritual realities that many people overlook before receiving communion. Some are obvious, others are subtle, but all of them share one thing in common. They break communion with God. And what is most concerning is that many who commit them continue approaching the altar convinced that everything is fine. What you are about to hear may be something no one has ever clearly explained to you before. It may disturb your conscience, but if you are willing to look at your life honestly, it could change your eternal direction. Because the first sin is not the one most people expect. The first sin we need to speak about, perhaps the most widespread and the most ignored in our time, is the lack of charity toward others. And this is where many people are immediately surprised, because when they examine their conscience, they usually focus on what they consider more serious and visible sins. Things like theft, adultery, or obvious moral failures. But in doing so, they often overlook something that Christ himself placed at the very center of the moral life. Jesus made it very clear that after loving God, the greatest commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. Yet what I have witnessed over decades in the confessional tells a very different story in practice. Many people believe they love God deeply, but at the same time they live in conflict with those closest to them. I have heard people say with confidence, "Father, I have not done anything seriously wrong." But when we begin to go deeper, another reality slowly appears. Constant arguments at home, a lack of respect toward a spouse, words spoken in anger that cut deeply into a child's heart, long-standing resentment toward a sibling, a neighbor, or a family member that has never been resolved. And at that moment, something becomes very clear. Charity is not just a feeling or an abstract idea. It is a concrete way of living. And when it is missing, something begins to harden within the human heart. Think for a moment about how many relationships have been damaged not by one major event, but by repeated small wounds. A harsh word spoken in anger, a sarcastic comment that seemed harmless at the time, a cold silence that lasts far longer than it should. Over time, these small actions build up something destructive within families. I have seen marriages collapse not because of one dramatic betrayal, but because of daily cruelty that slowly erodes love. Constant criticism, emotional distance, a refusal to listen, a lack of kindness in ordinary moments. None of these seem catastrophic on their own, but together they create deep separation. Lack of charity also appears in more subtle ways. It appears when someone secretly feels satisfaction at the failure of another person. It appears when a person chooses to ignore someone who is suffering simply because it is inconvenient to get involved. It appears when we see someone in need and decide it is easier to look away. And yet, in all these moments, many people continue their religious practices as if nothing has happened. They pray, they attend Mass, they speak about faith, but something within remains disconnected. Jesus said something we often forget. Whatever you do to the least of my brothers, you do it to me. This means every act of disrespect, every intentional coldness, every refusal of compassion is not only a human failure, but also a spiritual wound. And here lies a contradiction that is very common today. People who spend the week criticizing others, speaking badly about them, damaging reputations through careless words, and then on Sunday approach the altar as if nothing happened. But communion with Christ cannot be separated from communion with others. You cannot claim to receive the body of Christ while rejecting the brother or sister standing next to you. I have listened to confessions that reveal this clearly. Parents who suddenly realize they treated their children with unnecessary harshness for years. Children who recognize too late that they never truly appreciated their parents. People who discover that pride prevented them from asking forgiveness when there was still time to heal relationships. And when this realization finally arrives, it often brings pain, because truth always comes with weight. But something remarkable also happens at that moment. When a person sincerely acknowledges their lack of charity, when they stop defending themselves and begin to see their life honestly, change begins. Hearts that were once cold slowly open again. The desire to reconcile returns. People begin to seek forgiveness. Relationships that seem permanently broken begin to heal. I have seen this transformation many times, and it is one of the clearest signs of grace working in a human heart. But acknowledging this sin is not easy, because it is much easier to think of ourselves as good people. It is easier to compare ourselves with those who commit more obvious sins and conclude that we are fine. But charity is not measured by comparison, it is measured by love. It asks us to forgive when it is difficult. It asks us to love when pride resists. It asks us to rebuild relationships when walking away would be easier. And this brings each of us to a very uncomfortable question. Is there someone you have not forgiven? Is there someone you have wounded with your words? Is there a broken relationship you have been avoiding for too long? Because charity is not optional in the Christian life. It is essential. And when it is missing, even if everything else appears correct, something very important is already broken within the soul. But this is only the beginning, because the next sin we need to address is even more hidden, more subtle, and in many ways even more dangerous than most people realize. The next sin is one that many people find difficult to recognize, because it does not always appear dramatic or obvious. In fact, it often hides behind habits that seem normal, even harmless. But over time, it slowly weakens the soul in ways that are not immediately visible. This sin is a careless approach to the sacrament itself, especially receiving Holy Communion without proper preparation or reflection on one's interior state. Many people fall into a routine where they approach the altar almost automatically, simply because it is what they have always done, or because everyone around them is doing the same. There is a quiet assumption that if one is attending Mass, then everything is already in order. But spiritual life is never meant to become automatic. It requires awareness, examination, and honesty. Without these, even sacred actions can lose their meaning in the heart of the person receiving them. I have often noticed that people rarely pause to ask themselves whether they are truly prepared to receive Christ, not in a superficial sense, but in a real moral and spiritual sense. Have I reconciled with God? Have I examined my conscience seriously? Is there anything within me that I have ignored or justified without addressing? These are not complicated questions, but they are often avoided. And when they are avoided long enough, a person can begin to lose sensitivity to their own spiritual condition. There is also another layer to this problem. Many people today no longer understand the seriousness of interior examination. The modern mindset tends to focus on external behavior while neglecting the state of the heart. As long as life appears stable on the surface, people assume everything is fine within. But spiritual reality does not work that way. The condition of the soul is not always reflected in outward appearance. A person can seem calm, responsible, even religious, and still carry unresolved spiritual wounds within. This is why the practice of confession was never meant to be optional in the Christian life. It is not a ritual for extreme cases. It is a regular act of spiritual clarity. It allows a person to see themselves truthfully before God without illusion or self-deception. However, many people have gradually moved away from this practice or reduced it to rare occasions, and as a result, they approach communion-carrying burdens they no longer recognize as serious. There is a danger in this gradual loss of awareness. When conscience is not regularly formed and examined, it becomes easier to justify almost anything. What once would have been seen as wrong begins to feel acceptable simply because it has become familiar. I have seen this pattern many times. People who sincerely love God, but who slowly drift into spiritual blindness simply because they stopped reflecting deeply on their actions. Not out of rebellion, but out of neglect. And this is where the danger becomes subtle, because a person can continue attending Mass, continue praying, and still be disconnected from the depth of what they are doing. The Eucharist is not meant to be approached casually. It is not just a symbol or a community ritual. It is a profound encounter that requires preparation of the heart. Without that preparation, something important is lost, even if the external act remains the same. There is also a growing tendency to assume that sincerity alone is enough, that if a person is trying their best, then everything is acceptable before God. While sincerity is important, it is not the only requirement in spiritual life. Truth matters as well. Awareness matters. Understanding matters. A person can be sincere and still be mistaken. They can be devoted and still be unaware of serious spiritual issues in their life. This is why formation of conscience is so essential. And yet, this is often missing in modern spiritual life. Many people have never been taught how to properly examine their conscience. They rely on feelings rather than truth. They assume peace of mind is the same as spiritual readiness, even when it is not. This confusion can lead to a serious gap between outward practice and inward reality. A person may feel spiritually fine, while in reality carrying unresolved matters that should have been addressed long ago. And over time, this gap becomes dangerous because it creates the illusion of safety. The person believes they are close to God, while something essential remains unhealed within them. This is why reflection is so important, not to create fear, but to restore clarity. The goal is not anxiety, but truth. Because truth is what allows the soul to return fully to God without deception or confusion. And when a person finally begins to see themselves honestly, something often changes. They begin to realize that what they assumed was small may actually be significant. What they ignored may need attention. What they postponed may require action. This moment of clarity is not meant to condemn, it is meant to awaken. Because the real tragedy is not that people struggle spiritually. The real tragedy is when they no longer notice it. And this leads us to the next reality, one that is even more hidden and often deeply rooted in daily life, yet rarely examined with honesty before approaching the altar. Another sin that quietly destroys spiritual clarity is the habit of living with unresolved resentment and inner bitterness. Unlike open anger or visible conflict, this sin does not always show itself in obvious ways. It often stays hidden beneath normal conversations, polite behavior, and even religious practice. Yet inside the heart, it continues to grow and shape the way a person sees others and eventually the way they see God. Resentment begins when a wound is not healed. It can come from words that hurt, actions that disappointed, or relationships that broke trust. At first, it may feel small or justified. A person may think they are simply remembering what happened. But over time, when forgiveness is not chosen, that memory turns into something heavier. It becomes a quiet form of captivity. I have met many people who believe they have moved on, but when certain names or situations are mentioned, their emotional reaction reveals something deeper still present inside them. Sometimes it is sadness, sometimes it is anger, and sometimes it is a silence that speaks more loudly than words. The danger of resentment is that it slowly changes the interior world of a person. It affects how they pray, how they relate to others, and even how they perceive God's mercy. A heart that refuses to forgive often becomes a heart that struggles to receive forgiveness. Jesus spoke very clearly about this connection. He taught that forgiveness received from God is meant to flow outward toward others. When that flow is blocked, something essential in the spiritual life becomes obstructed, not because God stops loving the person, but because the heart closes itself off from that love. Many people do not realize how deeply this affects their spiritual life. They continue their religious practices, but something inside remains tense, heavy, or divided. Prayer feels less alive. Worship feels routine, and communion becomes something approached without full interior freedom. What makes this sin particularly serious is that it often feels emotionally justified. People can carry resentment for years, believing they are right to do so. They may feel that forgiving someone means approving of what was done to them. But forgiveness is not approval, it is release. It is the decision to stop allowing the past to control the present. When forgiveness is withheld, the person who suffers most is often not the one who caused the harm, but the one who refuses to let go of it. The wound continues to live internally, shaping thoughts, reactions, and emotional responses long after the event is past. I have seen how this affects families, marriages, and long-standing relationships. Sometimes the original conflict is long forgotten, but the emotional distance remains. Small comments turn into misunderstandings. Minor disagreements become triggers for deeper pain that was never healed. And yet, when a person finally chooses to forgive, something remarkable often happens. It does not always change the past, but it changes the present completely. The emotional weight begins to lift. The heart becomes lighter. Prayer becomes more honest, and a sense of inner freedom returns. Forgiveness is not always immediate. Sometimes it is a process that requires time and prayer, but it always begins with a decision to stop holding on to the offense as a defining part of one's identity. Without this decision, the spiritual life remains divided. A person can love God in intention, but still carry interior barriers that limit the depth of that love. This is why self-examination before receiving the Eucharist is so important, because it is not only about identifying external actions, but also about recognizing the condition of the heart. A heart filled with hidden resentment is not fully open to grace, even if the outward appearance of faith remains intact. And this is where many people are surprised. They assume that because they are active in their faith, they must be spiritually healthy. But activity is not the same as interior healing. Participation is not the same as transformation. God does not only look at what we do externally, He looks at what remains unresolved within us. And He invites us not to stay there, but to bring everything into the light so that healing can begin. This is why confession is not only about sins of action, but also about sins of the heart. It is a place where hidden burdens are finally spoken, acknowledged, and surrendered. When resentment is brought into the light, it loses its power. When it is named honestly, it begins to lose its hold on the soul. And when it is offered to God, something begins to change that no human effort alone can achieve. I have witnessed people who carried resentment for decades experience a deep release after finally confessing it, not because the past changed, but because their relationship with the past changed. They were no longer trapped inside it. And in that moment, the soul begins to breathe again. But even this is not the final layer of what we need to understand. Because beyond resentment, there is another reality that often goes unnoticed entirely, even by those who consider themselves faithful and devoted. And it is this next reality that often determines whether a person approaches the altar with true awareness or with hidden spiritual blindness. There is another reality that many people rarely consider, yet it quietly shapes the spiritual condition of countless lives. It is the habit of spiritual indifference, where faith becomes routine rather than a living relationship with God. This is not always expressed in obvious rebellion or rejection of belief. In fact, it often exists alongside religious practice, not in opposition to it. A person can still attend Mass, still say prayers, still identify as a believer, and yet slowly lose the sense of depth that makes those actions meaningful. Over time, what was once a conscious act of love can become something done out of habit, expectation, or cultural identity. When this happens, the heart begins to disconnect from what the body continues to do. Spiritual indifference is dangerous precisely because it is quiet. It does not feel like a dramatic fall. It feels like stability. Life continues, routines continue, religious practices continue, but something essential is missing: interior awareness. This is where many people stop asking deeper questions. They no longer reflect seriously on their spiritual state. They no longer examine whether their relationship with God is alive or merely maintained. Instead, they assume that because nothing feels wrong, everything must be right. But spiritual life does not depend only on feelings. It depends on truth, awareness, and ongoing conversion. Without these, even a faithful exterior life can slowly lose its inner vitality. I have seen this over many years of ministry. People who never intended to drift away from God, but who gradually stopped paying attention to the interior dimension of their faith. Not because they rejected God, but because they became distracted by life, responsibilities, and routine. And slowly, without realizing it, prayer becomes shorter, reflection becomes rare, examination of conscience disappears. And the Eucharist, instead of being a profound encounter, becomes something approached without deep preparation. This is not always noticed by the person themselves. From the outside, nothing appears wrong. But inside, something important is fading. Awareness of God's presence and awareness of one's own soul. This is why the Church has always emphasized the importance of returning to examination, confession, and sincere reflection, not as burdens, but as protection, not as rules for control, but as invitations to clarity. Because when awareness is lost, spiritual life becomes vulnerable. A person may still believe, but they no longer fully perceive the depth of what they believe. They may still participate, but without interior engagement. And this is where confusion can quietly enter. A person may begin to rely on external participation as proof of spiritual health while ignoring the condition of the heart, but God has always been concerned with both. There is also another subtle danger within indifference. It can create a false sense of security. When nothing feels spiritually wrong, a person may assume there is nothing to correct. But absence of awareness is not the same as absence of problems. This is why moments of honest reflection are so important. They interrupt the automatic flow of routine and bring the soul back into awareness of truth. They allow a person to see what has been neglected, what has been overlooked, and what may need healing. And when this awareness returns, it often brings both discomfort and clarity. Discomfort because it reveals what has been ignored, clarity because it shows the way forward. The purpose of this clarity is never condemnation. It is always restoration. God does not reveal truth to destroy us, but to heal us. He does not awaken conscience to overwhelm us, but to guide us back to life. And this is where everything we have spoken about begins to converge. Lack of charity, lack of preparation, resentment, and indifference are not isolated issues. They all point to one deeper reality, the condition of the heart before God. This is why the sacrament of confession is so central. It restores clarity where confusion has grown. It restores grace where it has been lost. And it restores communion where separation has taken place. Many people fear confession because they associate it with judgment, but in reality, it is an encounter with mercy. It is the moment when truth is spoken without fear and forgiveness is received without condition. I have witnessed countless moments where people entered burdened, uncertain, and heavy, and left with a peace they could not explain in human terms. Not because their life suddenly became perfect, but because their soul was reconciled. And that reconciliation changes everything. It changes how a person prays. It changes how they love others. It changes how they approach the Eucharist. What once felt routine becomes meaningful again. What once felt distant becomes personal again. This is the invitation that remains at the center of everything. Not fear, not guilt, but return. A return to clarity, a return to grace, a return to God. Because in the end, the most important question is not how long someone has practiced their faith, but whether their heart is truly alive in it. And if it is not, the path back is always open. And when a soul finally decides to return, even after many years, something extraordinary happens. What seemed lost is found again. What felt distant becomes close. And what was once heavy becomes light. This is the mercy that has been waiting all along.